Sir Philip Sidney is one of the premier Tudor writers of this time period. And he's just really one of the best ones because he's able to take the sonnet and to take it to a new level. And we're going to discuss some of that later on in our lesson. But first of all, we're going to go ahead and give you a heads up a little bit on why he has become such an important part of Tudor literature.
Literary criticism, the analytical study and evaluation of literature. It had quite an interesting origin, you know, literary criticism, that is. You see, it all began with Sidney, Sir Philip Sidney, the man who planted and watered the seed which grew into literary criticism. And he certainly was the gentleman for the task. Soldier, poet, writer, scholar, not to mention the family ties with the nobility. Sidney was a Renaissance man in the fullest sense of the word. In fact, his writings became some of the greatest examples of Elizabethan literature. Of his writings, Arcadia is the best prose fiction of his time. Astrophil and Stella is the most influential sonnet sequence. Oh, and most importantly, An Apology for Poetry is the source for the entire genre of literary criticism. It was Sidney who first developed literary criticism as a pattern for critiquing literature, outlining his ideas in his famous book, An Apology. Yes, he defended literary genres, especially poetry, but he also established a high-quality standard that previously hadn't existed. He strongly believed that literature, like any other product, should have certain rules for defining the stamp of fine workmanship. Rather amusing it is that Sidney should encourage such restraint and discipline in literature when his personal life was characterized by rashness. Nonetheless, encourage well-ordered literature he did. In fact, Sidney believed that good literature, especially poetry, more effectively teaches than, say, philosophical theories. Glasses. Listen to what he says. I say, the philosopher teacheth, but he teacheth obscurely. But the poet is the food for the tenderest stomachs. The poet is indeed the right popular philosopher. Ironically, Sidney wrote this statement in a book reflecting on the influence of the then immensely popular Greek philosophers. Sidney's brilliant contributions to literature and poetry were the result of his classical education and favorable circumstances, not to mention his incredible talent. Yes, he was certainly a well-rounded Renaissance man.
As you heard, that Renaissance man theme keeps cropping up in all of our authors during this time, which makes sense because this is during the time of the Renaissance and the Reformation. So the men of this era who are going to be influencing the politics and writing the literature are going to be reflecting that. And Sir Philip Sidney is just one of the many men who comes to the forefront at this time. Early Tudor literature had been rather depressing at times, especially before the composition of Sidney's Apology. Since the time of Chaucer, there really had been no English poet that had arisen to compare with the great literary masters of French and Italian poetry. Now, when Wyatt and Surrey had come to the forefront, you had some glory that was there, but they'd been dead now several decades, and the interim between Wyatt and Surrey and Sidney was not very prepossessing. The literature was not that great. So until Sidney comes onto the scene, there was nobody. And after Sidney, well, let's just say that the tremendous flowering of English literature that develops during the 1600s was in no small measure a response to Sidney's example in the style of writing and the level of writing that he develops. So he becomes then for us kind of the hinge upon which Tudor literature turns. Up until this time you're building, when you hit Sidney, then it kind of like kicks off and just totally develops into the golden age of English literature. Sidney is a man that does reflect his times. Like you heard mentioned, he was that Renaissance man. And he is involved in so many different things. And one of those would be this conflict that is occurring between the Protestants and the Catholics. Sidney was a very staunch Protestant. His father was a close companion to Edward VI, who was the first official Protestant monarch. But he was more than that. He was present in France during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre when Catherine de' Medici, who was the Queen Mother, she sent out the French army, and at that time all the Protestants were in Paris for the wedding between Henry IV and the Catholic princess. And between 70 and 100,000 Protestants were killed that day during that massacre, and he was there in the city during that time, and it just impacts him mightily. So he's definitely a part of those religious controversies of his day, and he's also involved in many of the political issues that are arising during this time. He is a rising minister of state. He becomes the darling of Queen Elizabeth. She wants to groom him and to create in him the type of statesman that she can entrust with diplomatic missions. And she does that. She makes him a cupbearer for a year, so he's in constant contact with her, being groomed, being developed, being molded into the type of man she can trust. And she sends him off to Germany, into the Low Countries in the Netherlands, to form a Protestant league against Spain, which was really a desire of his heart because he so believes in Protestantism. But he wasn't quite ready for the accomplishment, though, because his character is very rash. And he just was too zealous in what he believed, and he exceeded his orders that the Queen had given to him, and she has to recall him back to court because he just overstepped his boundaries in this diplomatic mission he was engaged upon. When he gets back, he's kind of banished from court soon after because Elizabeth's plays with getting married her whole entire reign. But in this particular time, he was very upset with this man she was considering to marry, and he writes her a letter, denouncing it, and she doesn't really appreciate that, so he's banished from a year from court. But it turns out to be a good thing because he does some very extensive writing during that time. Eventually, he recovers himself and he comes back, and he becomes a military commander of the Protestant Dutch who are fighting Spain, who was trying to come back in and keep the Netherlands and Holland part of their empire. And he is killed during that time, and all of Europe mourns for him. He really was really impacted them intensely, not just with his writings, but with his fervency of religion and in his ability to be a diplomat. Even though he made mistakes, he was a very worthy statesman. So that brings us to a significant literary influence that he is going to develop. Once his writings are published, remember, men of the Tudor period didn't publish their own writings. They were published after their death. Once they're published, it is then that English literature undergoes some profound changes, which we'll be talking about as we discuss this reading. And part of his genius lies in the range of his impact. It's not as if he were only a great literary critic or only a great poetic innovator. He was a master of many areas, which reflects his Renaissance training. For example, and you're going to want to know these things, they will show up on your test, Arcadia, which is the prime example of his prose fiction. Also, Apology for Poetry, which reflects his opinion on literary criticism. And then lastly, Astrophil and Stella, which is the first time that the English literature experiences a sonnet sequence. So we're going to be able to go through some of those things and see how he blazed a trail in the literature world with his energy and his vitality and his genius. He was such an incredible man, so that when he dies, like I mentioned before, all of Europe mourns him because he was a courtier par excellence, above anything that they had seen. And for months, the English nobility are going to wear black in mourning for him when he does die. He impacts so many people. Edmund Spenser in The Fairy Queen, who we'll be studying in just a few short lessons, models one of his characters after Sidney. And so you got to just think, even Shakespeare is influenced by him. So you sit back and wonder, and you're like, well, what if he'd been able to live a little bit longer? What might he not have been able to have done had his life not been cut short? We don't know, but we do know what he has done with many of his works. And so that brings us to the sonnets. You have Astrophil and Stella. And these sonnets are going to spark a vogue for a similar sequence of poetry in England. Astrophil and Stella are going to cause other writers to want to model their writings after this type of sequence. Like I mentioned, Shakespeare and Spenser. And it's going to be one of the most frequently republished works in the English language, these sonnets right here. Now, Sidney gets his ideas for this particular sonnet sequence from Petrarch. Remember Petrarch from Wyatt and Surrey when we were talking about how they brought the Italian sonnet in? Well, Sidney as well is going to be influenced by him. And he is going to be proclaimed the English Petrarch, the one who sets up for England much what Petrarch did for Italy. He is writing with his readership in mind. You always write towards your audience, and I know you've been pounded that's been pounded into you in your grammar classes. And it just goes to show you, even the literature we study, you have to know your audience. His characters are going to speak in an English accent. They're going to be voicing English concerns. They're going to be speaking about the spirit of the time that they are used to. And so he is going to create for us a sonnet that is very much appropriate for his day and age and his nation. Now the sonnet sequence that I've mentioned, I want to define that for you because it's basically many sonnets put together, like you can see, by one poet. But they're not just a bunch of poets thrown together like an anthology. They have a specific purpose because they all have a unifying theme or subject that they are talking about. So they just build on each other in that sense. Now, can you tell me what that theme might be? It was going to be very similar to what Wyatt and Surrey talked about in their sonnets, love. Unrequited love is their theme, or you can say unreciprocated love. It's not going to be given back. And then his particular sonnet sequence is composed of 108 sonnets. That's quite a lot of sonnets to write. And he also includes 11 songs within this sequence. So you can imagine, if you start out with sonnet 1 and go all the way to 108, there are quite a many different topics that are going to be discussed. Now, one thing that is really interesting is the name of this sonnet sequence, Astrophil and Stella. And the definition of their names is something that we need to remember because it very much plays into the themes that are going to be talked about in each of his sonnets. Astrophil means star lover. And he is in love with the very distant and the very unattainable Stella, whose name means star. So think of yourself here on Earth and you gaze off at those stars at nighttime and how far away they are and how utterly unreachable they are. And that's exactly the position you have in these sonnets. Astrophil loves the star. He loves Stella, but he can never have her. So these sonnets are going to be recounting Astrophil's alternating hope and despair as he tries to pursue Stella and win her love. And it really follows the typical love cycle. The man falls in love with a beautiful woman who utterly disdains his love. And the lover then becomes emotionally servile to her. He treats her some kind of goddess to whom he prays for mercy. She would just smile at him. His life would just be ecstatic. If she refuses him, if she scorns him, he just gets sick to his stomach. And you just have this vast range of emotions that he's going through. And the sonnet sequence ends with him just being frustrated and resigned to his fate, that he can never have his star. So remember that as we go through these sonnets, that they are building from sonnet to sonnet within itself. That's the big picture. But then again, remember what we talked about with our sonnets, each one is going to have a very specific point, a very specific theme that it's building on within those 14 little lines that is given to it. And so what we're going to do as we begin discussing these many sonnets that you have in your book is we're going to go through and give you the themes and show how that is developed within the sonnet's structure. And the sonnet 20 then is going to be developing the theme of love, but love that is identified with suffering and eventual death. And that is very clearly pointed out to us in the first opening lines. Let's take a look at that on page 169. You have, he has his death wound. He calls love, or that Cupid, that murdering boy that was a thief, that threw its bloody bullet at him, his arrow, Cupid's arrow, and he had this wrongful prey. He's very much consumed with the fact that he's been dealt a very nasty blow by Cupid, and how dare he be ambushed without his knowing. You know, he didn't ask to be put into love, but now he's been struck with it, and it's really affecting him. Because the first section of this sonnet is developing these feelings of bitterness, that he was this wrongful prey, that this little thief of a love god has come in and taken away his peace of mind from him with this hopeless love that he's been had. So the octet is setting us up for this bitterness. And what we need to figure out is, how does it progress? That is where the sestet is going to come into. How does Astrophil deal with this bitterness that he feels with being struck with this love? Because he is obviously frustrated, and we can see that in the sonnet as it progresses. And the sestet then brings the resolution to the sonnet by showing us that he ends up in this state of self-pity and helplessness. He is, has this "oh, woe is me" type attitude, that he cannot, and he's helpless as well, because he says, look at the last line, he says, "But ere I could fly thence, it pierced my heart." He's just helpless. How could he have avoided being forced to fall in love? He couldn't. He never had enough time to run, and then it was too late. He was stricken. So that is the beginning of our discussion of Astrophil, and we can see already just the range of emotions that he has and how that is going to tie into it. Now we're going to skip up to Sonnet 31. We're going to skip over 11 intervening sonnets. We're going to discuss Sonnet 31, which has a very specific theme that is similar to Sonnet 20. Again, this concept of this unjust suffering that he has been forced to endure. And that brings us to the octave, which is setting us up with this comparison to the moon. It's identifying Astrophil's sad progress of love with the moon itself. Take a look at the first couple lines with me, and we're going to see how he develops that. I love this sonnet. It's absolutely fascinating. It says, "With how sad steps, O moon, thou climbest the skies, how silently, and with how wan a face. What may it be that even in heavenly place, that busy archer in his sharp arrow tries?" Astrophil is not settling for any mean comparison here. He's saying, "Oh moon, you too feel what I am feeling. You too are lonely. You too are pale of face. You're being affected by love." He's like, how could that be, that even the moon himself is being forced to endure such things as we humans do? So the sestet then is going to build off of that. It's going to bring about this self-righteous tone that he has, where he's asking, how can these beauties who say they want to be loved, yet when they're loved, scorn us with such abandon and disdain? He's like, I don't understand it. Women want to be loved. I'm loving this woman, but yet she's scorning me. So he takes on this self-righteous tone of saying, well, I'm doing all that I can. And you have some of a petulant tone as well, as he bemoans the loss that he is enduring here in this frustration. And all it is doing is backing up the theme of this unjust suffering that he has. And that how wrong she is to be so proud and scornful of his love for her. But he doesn't always stay depressed and downhearted, because Sonnet 41 takes us along to a new theme. Here we see where he becomes hopeful in nature. He has, the octave is setting up for us this optimistic moment. Do you remember what was occurring in Sonnet 41? What is the backdrop? What is the setting for this hopefulness? Do you remember? Let's take a look on page 170, and hopefully that will refresh your mind. Sonnet 41 is dealing with some medieval traditions. It's going to be talking about the joust and these achievements of horsemanship and endurance that the knights were supposed to have. So he wins this prize of horsemanship, and everybody is praising him and his skills, even people from France. So he's very hopeful. And he says, really, the true cause of his victory is Stella, because she looked on, and from her heavenly face sent forth the beams which made so fair my race. So in this, Sidney is saying that all these people who are saying it's just his great talent that he won this, he says, no way, it was my love for Stella and the fact that she was there smiling at me that gave him the inspiration for him to win. And that's what the sestet develops for us, that Stella becomes his inspiration. And Sidney is really brilliant in this because he's developing that convention of courtly love here. He's really reiterating that facet of, or that particular principle of love romance, that the lover is stirred to bold deeds out of love for his mistress and a desire to impress her positively. Sonnet 63 is another hopeful sonnet, because in this one he is triumphant. And he is triumphant because he's able to take a rather insignificant rule and make it become incredibly important. For example, this one deals with grammar. And Stella had told him no twice. He says that he had asked her, he was craving this one particular thing from her, and she kept saying no, and she said it twice. And he says, well, then success then is, that must mean that she means yes, because two no's make a yes. And so there is hope developed in the sestet that she's going to accept him. Take a look there. I love the last line. It says, for grammar says, oh, this dear Stella way. For grammar says, to grammar who says nay, that in one speech two negatives affirm. And right there you can see the two negatives she has. So he says, two wrongs make a right, two no's make a yes, two negatives equal a positive. You learned that in math class. So he is extremely optimistic here that when she's saying no, she's really meaning yes. But you can see that just his obsession with her and his own desires here are causing him to create maybe an illusion out of what is really not there, which you can do when you fall in love, that you can pretend, or you can project upon someone what you want to see that may not necessarily be there. So that doesn't negate the fact that Sidney has proved for us that sonnets can be very witty in nature as well, and be very full of that keen sense of verbal sparring that can go back and forth here. And we see that how he took that with just a grammar rule and created a very fun sonnet for us there. Now the last sonnet that we're going to talk about is Leave Me, O Love. And this one you can compare with Surrey's one where he says farewell love and all thy laws forever, where he rejects love there. But Sidney and Surrey are going to have two totally different meanings, because here we see in this particular sonnet how that he is rejecting earthly love for heavenly love. And really what this sonnet is demonstrating for us is the Christian side of the Renaissance. Because Sidney, as we've talked about, he is very much involved in religion and his faith and in Protestantism. And you can see many biblical allusions in here. Take a look at the third line. It says, he goes, grow rich in that which never taketh rust, to that sweet yoke where lasting freedoms be. And throughout this sonnet, you have this sense where he is forsaking an earthly love because it doesn't bring satisfaction. And he is turning not to learning, but to God, who is sufficient for all that he needs. So, okay, let's take a transition here now, because we're going to leave the sonnets and go to more prose. We're going to see how he is going to develop an apology for poetry. And an apology here simply refers to a defense. And apology is the finest treatise of literary criticism and of prose essay that's going to come out of Tudor England. It's going to blend logic, levity, and moral earnestness and wit all together. It's a beautiful thing. I was just reading through it again just very recently, and I was just amazed at how well organized it is and how each line fits so, like, dovetails together so well. And what it's doing, it's defending poetry against criticism. It's defending, or it is a defense against the accusation that poetry is a waste of time and that it is a morally corrupting genre. And Sidney says, no, 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 no. He asserts that the study of poetry is superior. It's not inferior, it is superior to any form of study except for theology. Sidney is very conscious conscious throughout his defense that it is fiction he is defending. And those who study the other academic disciplines are regularly betrayed by the very fact that they have to be literal. So he's saying, while the poet here is more free than your other scholars because he's under no illusions. He can make a fictional statement as true as any other, and sometimes even more truer, because what he's asserting doesn't have to be literal. He doesn't have to stick straight with the facts. It's like poetry is a beautiful way to communicate truth because it is delightful to read. It's going to teach as it delights, which is something that philosophy and history or some of the other disciplines cannot do. So he asserts that poetry's purpose is to teach by delighting. You see, Sidney was firmly convinced that poetry was the best teacher for communicating knowledge and virtue. It was the monarch of the arts and sciences. Take a look with me on page 172, the third paragraph. It says, "Now therein of all sciences is our poet the monarch. For," and this is why he is, "for he doth not only show the way, but giveth so sweet a prospect into the way as will entice any man to enter into it." And if your goal with poetry is to communicate morality, then if poetry is going to bring men through the door, then use it. Because the value of poetry is what is counting here. And he says that poetry is superior to anything. Take a look with me at the very top of the page then. He's going to show a contrast to us between philosophy and history compared to poetry. He says, "The philosopher, therefore, and the historian are they which would win the goal of getting people to be more moral, the one by precept, the other by example. But both, not having both, do both halt. They are limited in their ability to do this. But poetry," Sidney is arguing, "is better because it has both of these things." Poetry doesn't deal with just poetry deals with the generalities, not just with the specifics like history has to. And poetry teaches universal ideas, not just one little thing here and there from history that the historian has to concern himself with. He's also arguing that poetry is superior to philosophy because poetry is able to make ideas visible to the mind, which is very important. If you can see a picture of something, your understanding of that concept is greatly broadened. So philosophy can't do that, but poetry can. And so Sidney says that poetry makes sure that knowledge will be visible through virtuous action. So philosophy is concerned with the abstract, but it can't create a visual picture. History is concerned with details, but it can't do generalizations. So poetry, therefore, has the best of both worlds, plus the added factor that it's very entertaining as it does so, and it delights its readers, causing them to walk through that door of learning, of knowledge and morals and virtues. And so you can see that Sidney has really captured himself quite well here in giving us this defense of poetry. And this is just a very short excerpt of a greater work that would illustrate some more of those concepts that we just don't have the time to go into right now, unfortunately. But it'd be very fascinating reading, and you might just want to go out and get it to see what else he would have to say. All right, let's take a look at your assignment and get you ready for what you do have to read, which is pages 173 to 177, and you'll be reading about Sir Walter Raleigh. But as you get involved with him, don't forget that you will also have a quiz to take in your next lesson.